In this next lesson, I will be teaching you about vocal effects and instrument effects. Now, what are vocal effects and what are instrument effects and why are they important? Let's say you want your voice to sound a certain way. Let's say you want your voice to sound all walkie-talkie-ish. Or let's say you want your guitar to sound very amped like crazy. An effect is kind of like just how you would do it when you're editing a video, adding, special effects, right? You're basically amplifying the audio to, your taste, how you want it to sound. Alright, so right here we have one of my latest songs called The Wall, and there are tons of vocal effects that I have implemented here. So for example, here at the very beginning of the song, I have a vocal effect on my screams to make it sound a lot more distorted and a lot more rough around the edge to really amplify that anger in the stream. Check it out. And this is what those screams sound like without the backing instrumental. Now you're probably wondering, okay, how did you achieve this? What methods did you take? And it's just screams, TenTillDeath. Could you even do, can you even do cool effects like that on any piece of audio? And here's the thing, what's cool about GarageBand is GarageBand, you have to literally, it's kind of like creating something from scratch. I mean, you do got presets and plugins in GarageBand that are provided for free, but most of the time, if you want to achieve a certain sound, you are going to have to play around with stuff. So, for example, this scream that you just heard, right? If we open up our settings right here and we go down to plugins and EQ, so for example, if we open up our settings on this track right here and we go to plugins and EQ, how I was able to even, make that sound was we can see what plugins, I call them effects. Most people call them plugins. They're actually called plugins. But these are the plugins I had. I had distortion. So distortion will distort the frick out of your voice. What I recommend doing is if you're going to do metal screams and stuff, add distortion. Play around with the distortion a bit. Then I have a high pass filter because distortion, right? Let me explain. Distortion will amplify the heck out of your voice and it can sound unpleasant in the headphones. So you have a high pass filter. And what high pass filter does is it tones it down a bit. It tones out the higher sound frequencies. So you can pretty much level the audio, right? So I'll show you what it sounds like with distortion on and without distortion on. Big difference, right? But this is not what you came here for. You came here because you're wondering, how can we add effects to our voice? What effects are there, or can we add effects to our instrumentals? You can literally add effects and plugins to any piece of audio here. You can add effects to your instrumentals, to your beats. I'll show you how to do everything. So, what you do is you find the exact track you want to add a plugin or an effect. It's called a plugin, but I call them effects, right? And you tap the settings, fourth icon at the top. You go down to plugins and EQ. And this is where you're going to see all of your effects and plugins right here on that track. You tap edit. And it has slots. If there's a green plus sign, that means it's an empty slot and you can add an effect in there. If it's not a green plus sign, and it has the minus sign, that means that slot is taken up by something else, and if you want to make space, you're going to have to remove a slot, right? So what you can do is you can press plus, and it'll bring up all the effects, all the preloaded effects. So you have Bit Crusher, you have Chorus Distortion, Flanger, Microphaser, Overdrive, Track Echo, Track Reverb, Tremolo, and Vocal Transformer. And those are just the first ones. And then you can go to audio unit extensions and you have more. These top two, Ghost Chorus and Zero Chorus. The Ghost Chorus, I paid for that. Zero Chorus was free. But then you have all these extra ones as well. So I'll show you how some of those sound. So I'm going to have to make a duplicate track because I do not want to kill my recording on this. But I'm going to show you how some of those vocal effects sound. Now, warning, this is just how those vocal effects sound before you make any changes. If you want to achieve a specific sound with these vocal effects, add the vocal effect and then make wanted changes. So, here we go. Now, this is just an example of the preloaded effects and plugins that are provided by Apple. Like I said, you can achieve any sound you want with these effects that Apple has provided, but you're going to have to change stuff like the settings. Like, you'll literally have to open up your plugin that you add, and you'll have to go in, change a setting, and go back and forth and just constantly re-listen to it until you finally hit that perfect sound. But these aren't all the effects. These are not all the effects. What you can also do is, like I said earlier, you can find more on the App Store. And there's some free ones you can find, and then there's some more paid for ones. My favorite one that I like using that I paid for was Ghost Chorus. It only cost me probably like $4 or $5. Other than that, you can find a lot of good free ones. But there's more effects that you can find. What you can do is right here where your tracks are, all these mics. You got to remember, all these tracks, all of these horizontal spaces are your tracks. What you can do is double tap the icon for that track. So like this track that we're on right now, it's a microphone recording track. We can double tap the mic, right? Then tap in the top left where you would normally go back to the main menu. And then you see what microphone you're using, right? It's a clean mic. It has the raw recordings, right? You can tap that mic, and then you have all these different effects. You can change your voice into a monster. You can change your voice into a robot. You can make your voice sound like it's coming out of a telephone. But that's not all. That's not all. For the people that do auto-tune, you have extreme tuning right here. Extreme tuning is auto-tune. And what you're going to want to do is, if you're doing auto-tune, right? You put it on auto-tune, and you're going to want to have to figure out the key that your song is in. And once you figure out what the key your song is in, you'll tap the top right in song settings, and then you'll change the key signature. And now the reason why is because whatever you set this key signature in, the auto-tune will try to adjust your voice to that. So if you if you turn on auto-tune, aka extreme tuning on your mic, and you change your key signature to a B major, it's going to try to put your voice in a B major. It's going to try to auto-tune it to that. Or if you change it to A minor, it's going to try to turn your voice into A minor, right? But these are not all the effects. These are not all the effects. I'll also say this. We'll go back to this real quick. You can literally, so notice how at the top it says drums and keyboards. You can literally record your voice on that. Yeah, it says drums and keyboard, but remember, it's just a plugin. It's just an effect. You can, also use your voice on those. Go on, play around with GarageBand. Test out with some of these effects. Find out what you like. Find out what you don't like. Find out what works for your voice. Find out what doesn't work for your voice, right? But here's where we have even more effects. So on the very top left, fifth button, you have FX. And this is song effects. So anything you do when you tap FX, anything you do is going to affect the entire song. So for example, now you're probably thinking to yourself, okay, that's a useless feature because I'm not trying to have that, affect the entire song. I just want it to affect one thing. Whoa, 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 whoa. Let me show you how you make the most out of this feature. With GarageBand, a lot of people get frustrated with GarageBand on iOS because they're not willing to put the time and work in. It's understandable. It's a very frustrating app. But once you understand how to use everything, you realize this is one of the greatest apps you can use as a producer. So, because you noticed right there, whenever I was playing around with it, it affected everything. It affected all elements of the song. What you can do instead is do this. You can, play around with things here. And then whenever you're ready to record, you tap the record icon in the top. And I'm going to show you something. Now, after you've recorded that effect, it'll show up all the way down here, right? And yeah, remember how it affected all of the tracks on the song, how it affected the entire song? What you can do instead is, hold on. Okay, what you can do instead, let's say you only want what you just did with FX right there to affect one track. What you can do instead is you can tap that one track. You can tap the microphone icon. Tap merge. Go all the way down. And merge it with the effects. And what it'll do is it'll create a separate file. A separate GarageBand project where these two tracks will be merged. And this also saves you space. This also saves you space on the song because you can only have a limit of 32 tracks. So now it's successfully merged that FX, recording with this auto-tune thing. So this is how it would sound. and see it only affects that because we merged it. It does not affect anything else. So, like I said, with all of these different effects, play around with the plugins and EQ. Figure out what works best for you. Literally, just play around with things. And now that you know how to do effects, figure things out for yourself, right? Go download some free plugins and stuff. Just tinker around with things. You'll figure it out. You'll figure it out. Now that you know how to use vocal effects, we can move on to the next lesson.